Okay, I guess let me get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joshua Phillips as our speaker this week in the Computational and Data Science Seminar. His talk today is a neurobiologically inspired deep learning framework for autonomous context learning. Dr. Phillips is a professor, associate professor, and associate chair, in the Department of Computer Science. He's also a member of the Data Science program and the Computational and Data Sciences PhD program. His research interests are in biophysics and cognitive science and development of new computational methods to address scientific and engineering problems. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Phillips. Thank you very much for speaking today.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Wallen. So I'll start out today giving you guys a little bit of a broad context here where this work fits. And there's some historical developments that we'll go through sort of leading up to this. My training coming into this as a machine learning researcher is still a little niche. So I've always sort of had this bent of doing neurobiologically inspired work. And so that means we're developing new frameworks and technologies that do heavily look at neurobiology, cognitive science, psychology, and we're trying to understand how humans and animals reason and use that as our inspiration for developing algorithms. So that's sort of where we're coming from. And in the general terms, this last term here in my title, autonomous context learning, that fits into a broader context called robust intelligence. So there are whole tracks at NSF and other studies that are trying to understand the idea of how we make AI more robust to be able to handle a wider range of tasks and different experiences. You could say that humans and animals are actually, we would consider us fairly good at things like that. We may struggle to learn always when we learn something new, but we do adapt pretty fluidly from going from one task to the next. So we're able to sort of tackle a wide range of different kinds of skills. And most machine learning and AI doesn't necessarily fall into that category. So I'll kind of make that clear, I hope, as the talk progresses, like why is this the case and why we need this. But we'll be looking at neurobiological inspirations the whole time for ways to guide that. So I've always been interested in this relationship here between the brain and cognition. You know, how do we use our thoughts and our reasoning to do all the interesting things that we do as humans, or even how animals function and work in the world. And we know that the brain is the underlying mechanism of that, right? Because you can damage the brain or impair it in different ways, and you can see that that impacts our cognitive functions. And so the modulation of the brain, because that's changing our cognitive behaviors, it must be the main locus of our cognitive behavior. Maybe not everything, of course, is distributed through the rest of our bodies and our nervous system, but there's a large part of the mechanisms involved in our cognitive processing happens in the brain. So understanding the relationship between brain and cognition can give us good insights into how we either understand how the brain works, what is it trying to do all these interesting things, but then also maybe we can use that to build artificial agents, engineer things based off of those principles to be able to do those same exact kinds of tasks. And those two fields talk to each other regularly. We will see that they're engineering by having formal methods that they can bring to psychology and neuroscience, allow us to study that more rigorously and hopefully understand what the brain is doing at even a mathematical, a model-based level like we see in all the natural sciences, where we're trying to understand how things work in forms of mathematical structures and equations. But vice versa, everything that we're doing over here in the neurobiology, we have a process of evolution that's made some very interesting structures that are very robust and compatible with our environment. And we're asking artificial machines to respond in that environment. So how would we modify our engineering methods, our artifacts, so that they can incorporate some of that learning into their mechanism? So I've always been interested in this kind of relationship. Now, at the lowest level, and I'm just doing broad overview stuff here at the beginning, just to think about it. Not everyone does neural networks research, I know, so I'm trying to give a little bit of intro on what neural networks are about. At the simplest level, what we're trying to think of is the individual components in the brain, which we know are neurons. They are the cells that seem to be the main building blocks of the brain and are probably responsible for the cognitive functions that we see in the brain primarily. There are other kinds of cells, support structures, and other things, but the neurons seem to be the information processing elements in the brain. There are billions of them inside a typical brain, and they're all connected together and perform some kind of distributed computation. We kind of think this is happening because if you look at what neurons do, they seem to communicate with each other. And there are two broad ways that they communicate, electrically and chemically. So just sort of thinking about this a little bit, we have, basic neurons have this structure where they can send electrical signals down these long axons. They're kind of like, you could consider them as kind of like electronic cables that you can see. And I'll use something that's a little easier to see, I think. The red sticks out a little more, so I'll use that from now on. So these long cable-like structures called axons act a lot like, you could say, electrical cables in an electrical system. So they're sending positive charges, these action potentials or spikes in positive charge that travel down that axon. And when they get to the end, we have these structures called synapses that are here at the end. I'll turn that around the wrong way. Let me fix that. I'm not used to these tools as much as my other ones, so I might bobble a little bit as I'm getting used to this. But the synapse here is basically a gap that's right in between the connection between the upstream neuron and a downstream neuron. So they connect between each other using these synapses. Now, once that electrical signal reaches the end of the axon, it releases neurotransmitter chemicals into the gap between the cells, and the downstream cell, the other neuron, will receive those signals. And generally speaking, this is how the neurons communicate with one another. Once those chemical signals are received by the downstream cell, that could have different kinds of effects. Generally speaking, you can summarize that as either excitatory, inhibitory, or neuromodulatory effects. So that means you could either cause the downstream cell to be more likely to fire, you could cause the downstream cell to be less likely to fire, or it could impact the way that the downstream cells is receiving other signals about trying to fire or not fire. Loosely speaking, that's what we think most of the types of cells are doing. And in the brain, individual neurons have a specific neurotransmitter that they communicate with. So you'll actually have lots of different kinds of connections. Some cells will connect that are inhibitory, some cells will connect that are excitatory, and some will be neuromodulatory, all connected to the same neuron and all affecting its behavior in these different ways. So, understanding how it's integrating that information is important. But we're going to let a lot of these details go, because from the perspective of looking at it from a cognitive perspective, some of those details may really matter, but other parts of them we might not need in order to perform certain kinds of cognitive processing. That's information processing in a useful way. So we'll just leave it at that as kind of the high level view. They communicate electrically. They do share these signals chemically using neurotransmitters. But those three main functions, excitatory, inhibitory, and then modulatory, are the things we might break them into. Even though there's a lot more that we could talk about. We could spend a lot of time on that. From an engineering side then, if we want to use this to sort of understand it from an information processing perspective, we usually then build what are called artificial neural networks that mimic the function of those neurons in the brain. Now, the way that basically works is coming up with mathematical formulas that seem to approximate that behavior. They seem to do something like this idea of integrating inhibitory, excitatory, and perhaps neuromodulatory signals and allowing something to sort of process that information and send it down to other processors that can do the same thing. But we do see then that we have these little artificial neurons that we will build, and there are simple equations that we have constructed in the sort of the deep learning community, we call it, where you utilize artificial neural networks to do some type of interesting engineering. We basically construct them using some very simple mathematical functions. Now, the basic idea, and I'm trying to basically, I'm trying to move this quickly, but at the same time give you guys some context here so you can think about it some. But you might see these, in other methods. But the idea is that we'll have some set of artificial neurons that we can build, and those are integrating signals from other neurons that are sending their signals, from sort of sensory inputs, you could say, feeding them into a set of neurons, and then those would then pass their signals down to other neurons. So they'll be connected in some sort of complex network to be able to make this happen. But the basic equations that we think sort of describe this are relating both the action potentials and the synapse. So that's the axons, you could say, sending the signals across, and then also the synapses themselves that are connecting the cells together. So the action potentials are usually sort of summarized to say that the neurons are firing often at some rate. So we usually turn it into something called a rate code. We don't have individual spikes, but in these artificial models, we sort of summarize what is the firing rate of a particular neuron. And you could maybe think of it as a range from like 0 to 1, where 0's not firing at all, and at 1, it's maximally firing. So that firing rate would be describing kind of the raw sensory input that cell, if it's a sensory cell, will be responding to some sort of outside stimuli, and it's actually generating signal in this range between 0 and 1. It's just one way to kind of interpret that signal. But these values X in this equation is one of those neurons sending that signal. And you could have many of them, right? So there could be up to N of these sensory neurons we're receiving from. Those are going to be sending signals to a downstream neuron, and they're going across these synaptic connections. So the key thing that's going to influence the flow of the information is really the strength of that synapse. That is, how tightly is the downstream cell wired to that upstream cell? Because if it's tightly wired, it's going to receive more of that neurotransmitter when it gets released into the gap. And it's going to receive less of it if it's less tightly wired. So loosely speaking, we need something to capture that kind of interaction. So we can capture the axon with a firing rate, sort of seeing what the electrical signals are, and we can simulate something like a synaptic connection by using another constant here, not a constant, but a scalar value called weight. And that just says what is the strength of the connectivity between that neuron and the downstream neuron. So that weight could either be a large magnitude value or a low magnitude value. So it's either magnifying or decreasing the impact of that sensory neuron's information on the downstream cell. Once we want to have some method then for sort of integrating all the signals that we're receiving together, since the cells receive from more than one neuron. We typically just model that by summing all those things together. So it could be a combination of inhibitory, excitatory signals that are all being summed up together. And that in the end is like the total amount of input that cell seems to be receiving. Now, there are lots of other ways that we construct artificial neural networks, but this is the most typical model that we find applied in engineering problems. So once we've sort of summarized and thought about a neuron in this way, we still need some way to turn that total input into sort of activity or spiking within that downstream cell. What information does it send downstream as a result of that net input? And that's usually calculated through some other function that we decide on. We mathematically model that using something called an activation function. And that's what I'm showing you here on the right. So this is a very typical example of an activation function, and I plotted it down below, net input on the x-axis as well as the y output on the y-axis, just to give you a sense about what the response profile looks like. As you have very, very low amounts of input on the negative side of the x-axis, you can see that there's very little signal or output along the y-axis. And then as you increase the amount of input in total, it seems to go up. But the firing rates sort of saturate at some point. They can't fire anymore just due to the physical limitations of, you could say, the hardware. The neuron itself can't really fire at any faster rate at some point based on the signals it's receiving. They kind of saturate. So loosely speaking, this is the model that's used in most artificial neural networks, although there are lots of different activation functions that you could choose from to represent this process. We're picking mathematical forms that seem to generally fit this principle of how neurons communicate, and that's what neural networks are usually about. Now, what are they really trying to produce? What types of things are they trying to calculate? That's a little bit harder to understand because they're working as groups together to be able to perform these kinds of functions. In summary, the only thing that I'll say for now is that if you have a large enough group of neurons connected using these sort of activation functions like I've shown you here, in theory, any function that's computable is computable. And there are proofs that exist to kind of demonstrate that. I'm just sort of sweeping all that under the rug for now, just to say that they are very powerful, given if you connect them up the right way, they can compute just about anything we could think that's computable. So that's just related to the engineering side. It doesn't necessarily say much about human and animal cognition, what makes that a little different, but it is something that's interesting to reflect on. So it does form a very general type of framework for representing computation. You can, anything you could think that is computable, there is some neural network that could be wired up to perform that computation. The issue is actually getting that wiring, being able to make it happen. And that's what learning is really about, trying to decide how those neurons need to be wired and connected together. Now, we have to skip over a lot. I'm not going to go into a lot more details about all the different methods that have been used, but the whole field of deep learning is about developing methodologies that allow you to be able to apply this principle to those different engineering problems and be able to solve them. Now, I might get back into some of the details here in a little bit about what those things look like. But suffice to say for now, as things have grown through the years, we're trying to solve more and more difficult engineering tasks, and they have seen a great variety of success. So some of the early successes are like recognizing handwritten digits in the MNIST data set, but those are sort of early examples. Later on, we had larger sets of images. You could do image processing and be able to classify and identify all kinds of things in natural scenes. And then also we've got models that can even perform all kinds of tasks like being able to solve Atari games or drive cars and other sorts of things. So I'll talk a little bit about that more in context when we get to it. But the point is that this basic idea of these artificial neurons, you can build them up into networks, and through experience with an environment of some kind, whether it be natural scene images or it be some sort of game where you're playing interactively, there are ways, algorithms that exist to be able to train up those connections in the network so that it's able to perform that task better over time. So we'll sweep a lot of details under the rug and maybe get back to the relevant ones when we see them show up for some other tasks I'll talk about in just a little bit. So one of the things that I want to point out, though, is that when we are trying to figure out how to solve these tasks, we often go back to the brain for inspiration on how to start out with our initial wiring for our connections. So if you just threw a random bunch of neurons like into a network and then asked it to learn something, it can be quite difficult for that model to be able to learn the function that you're asking for. And a lot of that happens to be because our brains aren't just wired randomly when we are put into the world. And that means that if that's the case, we need to become pre-wired in some way as humans or animals. We have some sort of architecture given to us by nature. And that sort of primes us or getting ready for the kinds of things that we need to learn in the real world. So there is a lot of, while there is a lot of nurturing that goes on in our experience, we have to experience things in the world to learn. The other side of the coin is nature, which is the things that we've already been given. And it does turn out that if you don't pre-wire things in a certain way, it's just very, very difficult for that network to find the weights that will solve the task, to connect and finish the wiring, polishing it up so that it's able to learn the thing that you're trying to get it to learn. So the best successes throughout the years have always been things that are tuning the model with some sort of pre-wired concepts and looking at pathways, usually inspired by how the brain has tried to do something similar, so that they can use that as inspiration as our starting point. And then from that point, the network is able to be able to learn that particular task because it has come with this piece of nature built in that gives it kind of a step up, a leg up in where it's trying to go. So the technical term for that in deep learning is known as the inductive bias, which is saying it's putting a bias into the model that allows it to learn or induce certain kinds of functions. So you need this kind of bias so that you can actually learn the function. It's an extremely complicated one. Without it, it's very difficult. Doesn't mean that the model couldn't eventually get there in principle or under certain conditions get there in principle. It's just highly unlikely to ever happen. So we're trying to make sure that we can make it more likely. And so we're using the brain as inspiration. So some early successes with this stem a lot from what we call convolutional architectures. Now, I'm mainly using this to illustrate the relationship between dealing with the way the brain is wired and what these architectures do. And there is more work that was even done before what I'm showing you here. So Fukushima, even back in '73, had already built some models based on the occipital lobe, which is really what we know as the locus of sort of sight, primarily in the brain. And that's really what was inspiring some of these early architectures in trying to solve vision problems, like some of the things I've already been demonstrating to you guys so far. So looking at how that area is wired, researchers were inspired on how they might come pre-wiring their networks to be able to allow this to happen. So the way this is generally working out is that each of the neurons in these areas seems to only respond to a very limited spatial field inside of the model. So unlike having a neuron that can kind of see everything or look at everything, we restrict exactly what region it's able to respond to. That just naturally falls out of the biology. But we see that that also applies in layers downstream in the occipital lobe. So normally we get photons in from the outside, they're hitting some of these initial sensory cells and they're responding to the photons and they're sending the electrical signals back to the occipital lobe for initial processing. And those neurons seem to be arranged in this type of convolutional architecture. So you can actually look inside the cells and see that they seem to respond in the first layer in this sort of region where only the cell might only respond to a very restricted area, which kind of makes sense because of just physical constraints. But then even subsequent layers after that, that receive that input from that layer after they've already generated their signals, also seem to be wired as if they're looking at subpatches of the earlier neural tissue. And if this is the case, it looks like it's applying that sort of relationship over and over again through many layers. Now, there are limits on how far it goes before it switches what it's doing, but the idea is that you're sort of having neurons that are responding to these local little receptive fields. And that has been some of the most successful ways to pre-wire a network for doing these types of image processing tasks. Now, in the end now, when you read about them or you look at convolutional architectures, though, people will focus on what they actually do. That is the mechanism that comes out, not necessarily the neurobiology anymore. So if you hear people talk about convolution or architectures, what they're really saying is that that neuron can now be looked at as a feature detector. It's trying to detect something of interest, but it's actually now we're applying that same feature detector to anywhere in the image. So we're sort of sliding it around so that we could detect the same item regardless of where it appears in the image, meaning that we're training the inductive bias, the propensity of the network, to automatically learn. If it has learned a particular feature that it needs to detect, something it needs to look at, it could do that anywhere inside the given image. So it's just built into the architecture from the start that it doesn't matter where some particular object resides, it's going to be able to detect it anywhere. But we're building that into the model rather than just starting from one from scratch that has no assumptions about such a thing. This allows it then to overcome limitations like being able to detect that same thing, even if it happens in a different area of your visual field. So this has been around for a long time, and it's the basic mechanism people have used. So I'm just trying to give you guys the idea that it was inspired by the brain, and then we look at it and find engineering principles that map to that. But then after that, when it gets into deep learning, people kind of forget about how the brain was the inspiration in some ways. We look at how the engineering principles apply, and we use that as an abstract model of how we would try to solve these kinds of tasks. So this will come up again when I start talking about some of the later work that I'm trying to talk about here today. So let's do that then. Okay, I want to start getting into what we're really interested in. So there are other areas of the brain that often aren't used as much in the deep learning literature. That is, we haven't studied them as deeply or done as much investigation. And one particular area is something known as working memory. And working memory is a type of cognitive capacity that we have in humans and animals. So working memory is a particular kind of memory, keeps task relevant information. It solves something kind of called the out of task, out of mind problem. It's usually best to kind of look at examples to think about how you do it. So if I give you a phone number, right, and you dial it into your phone, for a brief moment, I'm giving you the digits 615-324-8967, and that's just an arbitrary number I made up, right? But I'll give you those digits. You'll remember them in your working memory for a very brief time until you type them into your phone. But then you'll hit save, and then you pretty much forget about them. And you probably never remember them ever again, right? So it has something that's very task specific, focused, and you need it. But at the same time, you can just throw it away as soon as you're done with it. It's usually good to think about this in contrast to other types of memory. So like, for example, you have other things like long-term memory, which is what your mother looks like, or how you write your name, or these kinds of things. You never forget really how to do these things, right? They're always there with you. But that's different from the idea of working memory. That phone number, I'll never remember that phone number again. It's gone. So this is more volatile, right? Same thing if like you're trying to make a recipe, right? You remember the ingredients you need in the moment, you get this little part of the recipe done, but then you just kind of forget about it. You may not even remember them, and you have to go back to the recipe later to remember how to do it, right? It doesn't stick in your long-term memory. Now, there's one other thing that I want to bring up that will set the context here. There are memory systems that sit in between, and I don't want you to be confused about it. So working memory is this very task-specific, sort of limited focus. You can only hold on to a few things at a time, usually no more than 3 or 4 things. But there are other kinds of memory that sit in between that aren't really quite long-term, and they're not quite like working memory. One example is episodic memory. Episodic sits in between because I can ask you a question like, okay, where did you park your car today? Now, if you're parking on campus, the point is you could probably pull out, I remember where I parked, but you weren't thinking about it a minute ago, right? So you were able to recall it, but it wasn't in your mind's eye. That's different from working memory. Now you've got it in your working memory, right? You're storing where now you parked your car. But even in 20 minutes, when you forget about that, you'll still be able to remember it again, right? But if I was to ask you, where did you park, 10 days ago? It's going to be harder for you to remember something like that, right? Maybe not impossible, but pretty rare because you're remembering a distinct episode of when you parked. It's not like long term because it's not something you remember forever, but it's also not like working memory because it doesn't just go away and disappear. It has this intermediate area of recall. So I just want to put that out there to remember that there are different kinds of memory, and we're mainly addressing this idea of working memory for now. This is very task specific, and we're trying to understand what might be the basis of that. But the question then is, okay, let's if this is a cognitive task that seems to be of use, where could that possibly be happening in the brain? So there's been some early evidence that's tried to show what kinds of mechanisms might be involved in this. So early evidence suggests if you put people in fMRI scanners, for example, which measure brain activity in different regions, and you ask them to perform tasks that we know involve working memory, these types of tasks, then if you measure the parts, what is lighting up inside their head, that is what regions in the brain seem to be the most active, when that information is maintained, you find that there are certain areas in what we call the prefrontal cortex that seem to light up. So this is something that tends to show up again and again throughout working memory tasks. While that information needed to be remembered, you could see that area of the brain actively being used. The signal from the fMRI scanner says those neurons must be on and active. But then as soon as that information could be thrown away or let go, you'd see the signal fade and disappear. So it's correlating that. We think that the prefrontal cortex may be the place where memories are kind of stored, right? It's like the storage location for your working memory. And if you look inside that particular area of the brain, it's these sort of frontal regions are not perfectly towards the front of your head, but they're kind of a little bit further back, prefrontal is what it's called. And you look at the type of anatomy that's there. How are the cells wired? That gives us some inspiration about maybe how that area might need to be wired if we were to build an artificial system that was similar. And if you look at that region, you find that there are these tightly recurrent connections amongst these individual groups called stripes. But then those stripes, even though they are tightly connected with the neurons within a stripe, they're not connected so much across stripes. So you seem to have these patches of tissue, which we call stripes, that are tightly connected with one another, but then they're not connected to their neighbors. They seem, if you look at what that might produce in terms of information processing from a neuron's perspective, it seems like those then, by having this self-excitatory sorts of loops, you have neurons in the same stripe exciting other neurons in the same stripe, they would be set up to sort of form these kinds of fixed point or stable kinds of behavior. They're sort of self-excitatory or able to hold on to particular patterns. So they seem maybe pre-wired to do that. Now, it doesn't mean we've solved the problem entirely. So I'll talk about the difficulties of this idea in just a minute. But just keep in mind that we think the prefrontal cortex seems to be the locus of something like this. So besides this, there are some other things that we'd have to think about, right? So I'm going to flip down for just a minute. Well, no, I'll stay up here from there for now. So the question that comes up though is if you have these stripes of connectivity, then these things could maybe hold on to a pattern. They could keep this recurrent activity going, but it's not clear then why they would ever release a pattern. Once they've gotten started firing and they're sort of in a stable pattern, there's no reason to suggest that they would flush it out. And yet we know working memory gets rapidly updated in this way. So people started thinking, what could be the possible neural basis of this? What could be the thing that's sort of controlling that? Because the cells themselves just seem to be wired up to hold on to things and don't really have a mechanism for causing things to fade away. And a lot of that answer came from some other work that's from a completely different brain region. So this is something called the ventral tegmental area, the substantia nigra pars compacta. We often call this the basal ganglia. It's the whole region that's responsible for the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine is the kind of neurotransmitter that you kind of have, it's responsible for chocolate. Like you get a shot of chocolate or you get something that's rewarding. It makes you kind of like feel good. It's kind of the idea it's usually associated with. But it seems to have a more specific role than just that sort of nebulous concept when we apply it in the brain. So here's why we think such anyway. If you look at the actual wiring inside of the brain, you'll see that it seems to be heavily wired to two brain regions, primarily the prefrontal cortex, and then also an area called the ventral striatum. Now, The ventral striatum seems to be something that's kind of related to actions and decision making in some ways, but it's very much like motor based. So if you try to do something or act on something, you can see this area kind of light up. But it's not so clear what its relationship might be to the prefrontal cortex. But if you sink electrodes down into those basal ganglia cells and you record and see what they're doing, they have an interesting pattern. In particular, if you put them into, so you can try to have, say, some sort of experiment where you're sitting a monkey down and they're just sort of staring at this a screen maybe, and you just show a quick, you just sort of give them a sip of juice, right, just at randomly, something that's rewarding. So you're recording from the cells, and then you see you give them a reward, you'll see that the cells respond immediately after, like in response to the reward, sort of like the chocolate idea. But if you decide now maybe 5 seconds before the light comes on, I'll start shining a light, and every 5 seconds, this is going to come on, and you do this consistently, we're doing a form of classical conditioning. Eventually, the cells start to respond for the light. And you can kind of think, oh, maybe it thinks the light is now rewarding because it's being associated with this juice that's going to inevitably come. But the interesting thing is that the cells do not respond for the juice any longer. They only explicitly respond for the light. So it's a strange thing that's going on, right? The light is now triggering the dopamine response, and you're not getting it from the raw signal. Really interestingly is if you actually now shine the light after a lot of training, but then you decide to withhold the juice, you will see the initial spike, just like we saw before, but then you also see a subsequent depression in the signal of the cells. So this led people to kind of theorize what might be happening inside of these cells. What is that they're computing? And it turns out that there's already algorithms out there in the machine learning world that capture this kind of phenomenon. So they come from reinforcement learning. So a few years before, these algorithms are called temporal difference learning algorithms. They compute something known as a temporal difference error. And it looks like a temporal difference error is exactly the kind of thing that the dopamine neurons are producing. And so the idea is kind of like it's a difference in a change in expected future rewards or a change in your expectations. So you might look at this top example here. The monkey is just sort of waiting around going, well, the world's not good, the world's not good. But then suddenly it receives the juice. So it went from like bad to good. There was a change. And so it's like a positive change, right? Went from something bad to something good, net positive. The delta signal, the number that gets calculated by those equations would be positive to suggest that you went from sort of a state we thought wasn't so good to something that is good. And you see the cells respond. Now, the same thing happens in the second, once the monkey's been trained up with the conditioned stimulus, when the light turns on, it already has learned that the light is, something that's going to pay off. So it gets to this point where the world's not good, the world's not good, the light turns on, oh, this is actually a better system, I'm about to get rewarded. So you see the positive spike. But when you get to the real reward being delivered, well, it knew that it was going to happen, right? It knew that I was going to get rewarded. It was thinking positively, and yes, the positive thing came. So the difference between those two is nothing, right? It's zero. So you don't see any response in the cells. It's the change that they're responding to, not the actual, not the details of the stimulus itself. So if you see the situation where you shine the light, the world was bad, we shine the light, oh, we're about to get rewarded, you see the positive signal. But then later on, when the juice is withheld, because you thought the world was going to be good, but it didn't pay off, it's a negative signal, negative going, and that drops down, produces a depression in the dopamine signal. So why is this important? Okay, the reason is because if you think about where the dopamine system is wired to the ventral striatum, those tend to be signals that are related with motor functions and turning actions on and off. And then the prefrontal cortex seems to be related to sort of things where you're trying to store or not store certain memories. So these reinforcement learning algorithms, which have been used to train up sequences of actions, so they used to solve tasks like solving mazes or playing a game of chess or making a cup of coffee, there's some sequence of actions that you have to learn to perform. That's something that would would connect in here, is that we have similar kinds of actions that we're trying to perform. It makes sense for this ventral striatum connections, but what are they doing in the prefrontal cortex? So that caused some people to theorize, and so these are O'Reilly et al., to sort of think, well, what kind of effect might they be having on these prefrontal neurons? And they hypothesized that that dopamine signal could be used to modulate. Dopamine is a neuromodulatory neurotransmitter, modulate the impact on those prefrontal cells. And what we think is happening is that that particular set of cells is now being modulated to either gate in or gate out certain kinds of signals. So this is a long intro, but I just don't want you guys to think to tell you I'm misunderstanding what we're looking at here with the idea behind this. The basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex are the two main things underlying working memory. And we have a lot of biophysical evidence that inspires us to maybe wire up mechanisms that use this. I'm going to skip ahead here now to try to get ourselves moving along to the main project that we use this as inspiration for. So using this as inspiration, we built some neural network models that tried to wire up and use those mechanisms, but we're trying to abstract away the biological details now. Rather than trying to think about all the details about how these things really need to be wired up in the brain, what are the core things we can cut away with, looking more like how convolutional architectures and neural nets look like now? How do we get down to something that we can abstract and apply across a wide range of tasks? So some of our early work looked at building in this software framework called the Working Memory Toolkit, which built in these TD learning mechanisms and allowed a system that could select between different kinds of memories for storage in this prefrontal cortex. So we wire up all the different components, and sure enough, they're able to store these things. And that was applied to a wide range of different tasks. But it was difficult for people to program for certain reasons. So we basically, because there are lots of different parts that a programmer had to specify. So it got used and was useful, but sort of fell out of use because of the difficulty in tying it to particular domains. Down the road, we wanted to sort of fix that problem. So we came up with this architecture that involved this thing called holographic reduced representations to simplify that problem. So holographic reduced representations are really just random vectors that you choose to represent concepts. So we draw from a normal distribution, generate a random vector, and we tie that to a particular concept. So you could say maybe this vector represents red, we've got another vector that represents ball. But an interesting thing that you can do with these kinds of representations is you can combine them together using a process called circular convolution that will recompress them back into vectors of the same size. So you can actually convolve these things together, red and ball, to create the concept of red ball. And now it's compressed back around through this operation called circular convolution so that it recompresses the information back in. Now, the important thing about this is that the red ball looks as a distinct concept from red and ball. That is, it looks like they're orthogonal to the representations that we see for red and ball independently. So red, being a random vector, is usually orthogonal to ball when it's drawn from a random distribution, just because of the properties of the dot products involved. You just randomly end up pointing in orthogonal directions. And when you perform the circular convolution, you're compressing a sort of form of lossy compression, but you get a resultant vector that combines both concepts that's also orthogonal to all the others. The reason why that's useful is it keeps all the concepts parsimonious and separated from one another. And that's a useful feature for most neural networks, so they can understand that those should be treated differently. And that's very important for certain kinds of learning with neural nets. So I'll push ahead and kind of show why this is an interesting mechanism, okay? So normally when we're trying to solve different kinds of tasks, let me get here. Let's skip over some things. All right, so normally if we were trying to ask different kinds of models to learn all these different kinds of tasks, it can be very difficult to ask a neural network to tease them apart. Traditional ways to be able to make sort of models respond robustly and switch to different situations would require that you actually provide inputs to switch between different types of tasks. So for example, if we just did a traditional neural network architecture, we're just going to solve one task, one function f. That's usually how we wire it up. So we make our neural network and we train it on our data, and that ends up being our solution to the problem. But if we wanted to make something that's adaptable and could switch between different tasks, we think that would involve some form of working memory. The reason for that is because there are actually psychological tests that have demonstrated just this kind of behavior. So I'm going to flip back to where we need to see that. So one of the best examples of that comes from the psychological literature and what's known as the Wisconsin card sorting task. So the Wisconsin card sorting task is something where you ask someone to solve some kind of categorization problem, and they will eventually learn to solve this problem just through feedback, saying that they're right or wrong with the answer that they're giving. So usually you're given stimuli that are like something like you see up here. I've got like a red square with a dot in the middle, and then what I'm at, and I'm saying, okay, sort this either into the left pile or the right pile. And you can either be right or wrong. It either should be in the left or should be on the right. Now, right now, what we're trying to say is that there's some rule associated with it that we want the person to learn. We don't know what that rule is. We have to learn it over time through the feedback. So here we see the first stimulus is that red thing. So we guess red, and we get the answer that no, you were not correct. That's not right. So okay, so we've got to figure out what it is that we want to go for. Next time we'll see another stimulus. It's a red with a circle plus in the middle. This time we guess square. So in this case, we say, yes, we got it right. So the distinguishing mark between the two is, right, we guessed color on the first one, didn't get it right. Here we're responding with the shape and we're getting it right. So we think we've learned the rule. So we'll move on to the next one. And when we answer circle, sure enough, we get it right. So it seems like what the experimenter is wanting us to do is learn what the shape is, right? And we respond with that corresponding answer. But after a while, what you do is the experimenter is you're kind of mean. You say, okay, well, what if we just switch the rule on you? We don't tell you. So what happens is then the feedback suddenly changes, right? I'll get the new stimulus. The experimenter hasn't told me there's a new rule. I answer with shape, triangle, and I get it wrong. But what that's going to do is trigger a kind of reorientation of your thinking and your working memory to say that maybe the old rule doesn't apply anymore, and we need to try something else to be able to learn the task. So inspired by that idea, we want to find some way to do this robustly in deep learning models, to be able to engage working memory to switch between different representations so we can learn these different tasks. The reason why we want to do that is because in most deep learning work, we just don't have the ability to solve these kinds of tasks. So if you wanted to solve more than one task at a time, you're fixed to a certain way that you might make it work. So here is the most typical example. You might just say, all right, let's provide an additional input to our model that says what task we're working on. But that's something as the experimenter that you have to guide and provide the input as. It's not internal to the model. It's not able to do it robustly. Something from the outside has to tell it what the task is. Another possible thing is to actually make it learn multiple functions in the output. It just solves all tasks at the same time. But the problem with that approach is that if that's happening, you don't experience the world this way. You typically solve one task, and then you might have to move on to another, and you may come back to that other task later. But you're not really getting feedback and able to see that on all tasks simultaneously. So the typical deep learning approaches that try to overcome this multiple task learning problem don't really exist right now in current deep learning architectures. You need some kind of working memory-like mechanism to be able to switch out internal representations about what task you're performing, and that allows you then to maybe robustly solve these types of problems. Now, our approach here then involves folding in these kinds of holographic representations, and we're sort of using this idea from working memory. It's your feedback signals that can tell you whether you should switch different representations in or out, just like we've seen before with the basal ganglia. But then we also have something kind of like the prefrontal cortex. We have a storage location that's sort of maintaining what the current context is, the vector that we're working with at the moment. And we're going to learn the context on that representation. So we say we're going to take whatever it is inside of our model, and we're going to use these holographic representations to learn different tasks. And you can swap those different vectors out to represent those tasks over time. So that allows us then to build this kind of new architecture that we've created here. Now, the reason that makes it stand out is because there have been existing frameworks in the deep learning community to try to, to do this, right? To solve these different tasks, but to robustly do it built into the deep learning framework, there were some additional mechanisms that we had to add. So in particular, we developed two main things. The first is our architectural component, which is known as the context layer. And the context layer inside maintains a list of these different vectors, and they're just randomly chosen. We can just say it has some amount of random context that it can use as its pool of possible representations. But you still, even if you have that, you have to choose one of those representations that you're going to convolve with. And that's what's currently in your mind's eye or in your working memory. So it's the current task you're kind of working on. But do you then need some mechanism to be able to swap them out or make modifications when the tasks change? So for that, we developed a switching mechanism that we can plug into the model. And that's sort of represented, let me put it the other way here, by these keeping track of two different quantities here. So the first quantity on the top is saying, how good have you, what is your error that you're kind of been experiencing on this particular task? So you can imagine when you first start a task, you expect that you're going to have lots of errors. You're not going to be doing so well. But after you've kind of learned the task and started doing well, you have a good history, your errors should be relatively low. The system has learned that you pretty much solved this problem. So that means we keep track of this over time. For every task or each representation we're working with, we want to keep a history of that. And that's just being iteratively maintained. We don't have to like store all of it. We're folding up that, sort of taking a moving average of the kinds of errors that we're performing for that particular representation. And then likewise, we keep track of just looking at what are the differences now in the current moment between what we've expected. So that's what I'm highlighting down here below, is that in any moment, we want to make a comparison between what kinds of errors are we currently experiencing and what our expectations are. So if our expectations match what we expected, then we're fine. We don't switch anything. But if we see that there's a discrepancy, basically we just set a threshold to say how, if we're getting far enough away, perhaps we should switch to one of these other tasks or other representations. So the basic rationale being that if I have a task that I'm suddenly are doing really poorly on, right? It means that I usually have been doing really well. Suddenly I'm doing really poorly. I've had a difference in my updates. The basal ganglia would be sending a signal to the prefrontal cortex to flush out the representation and try a new one. And that's analogous to the mechanisms we would use for switching between tasks as well. So over time, we can have tasks where we train on one task, we might get good at it, but then at some point, if that task demands switch and change, we can switch to the new function that we're trying to learn. So what we did was take our little context learning mechanism and plug that into a different set of multiple different tasks that we could use to then try to test whether or not this was a feasible approach inside of the deep learning. Now we've added these two different mechanisms, right? This dictionary of holographic representations that we're using circular convolution to separate those different types of tasks from one another. And then we also have this error monitoring mechanism, which is what the basal ganglia are producing. So we're sort of building in those additional mechanisms which don't exist currently in most of the frameworks that are out there. So adding those into our context layer, we added that to the Tensorflow Keras framework. So this is an example of a model that we chose. And now we're training it on different logic gates. So there are actually 8 different tasks that we're learning, and we're switching between the 8 different tasks. We'll train one for a while, and then we'll randomly switch to another. We don't tell the network. We just let it continue on its way, and we see whether or not it's able to robustly respond. And as long as it has enough of the representations that it needs to be able to solve the task, then we end up finding good performance. So for example, if you just give it one ATR, this kind of task will cause a model to be a chance. And one ATR, one of these representations, is really the same as just a regular deep learning model without any of these mechanisms in place. Because if you have one representation and you can't switch to anything else, you're just stuck with that one representation. It's essentially just doing a regular plain deep learning model. So on these tasks, that model will train to be a chance because it never can predict exactly which of the tasks it's going to be facing next. So it really learns none of the functions as a result of the confusion of trying to learn all 8. But if you start to see representations, if we give it 3 to use, it starts to get a little better. And then if we actually train when we're giving it all 8, we're seeing we're able to learn all 8 tasks perfectly. So it's able to store all 8 logic functions, but each one is stored on one of these ATR vectors that are stored inside the model. But that's all adaptively done on its own. We don't program it, it programs itself to be able to swap out and learn those 8 different logic gates. And whenever it's tasked with solving the other problem, it can just switch to the appropriate mechanism. So it's always able to keep track of simultaneously all 8 problems, right? Even though the inputs are exactly the same, they're always just a pair of bits and the output is just 1 bit. So that allows that model to robustly deal with that kind of situation. We also then made sure that it was compatible with general deep learning architectures. We didn't just want to limit it to a basic multi-layer perceptron, simple architecture. So we combined it with the convolutional architecture where we use the MNIST digits and we solve some mathematical functions. So for instance, maybe you're just trying to answer the question about whether you are dealing with even numbers, right? So half the digits are even, half the digits are odd, or maybe you're supposed to respond with the opposite answer if it's an odd number. And then also there's something that's in between, like what if the number is divisible by 3, yes or no? So all these are yes or no answered questions. We just have one output and it needs to say yes or no, but it's switching between the different task domains. And over time, it learns to assign those to the relevant context and use its working memory so that it can learn all three tasks inside of the same model. And and even with sequential training, this is normally something the deep learning models suffer from, but our models are able to train completely on task 1, switch to task 2, train up on task 2, switch to task 3, train up on task 3. And whenever it cycles around randomly through any of them, it will just respond back with perfect performance, switching right back to the other task. On top of that, we tested on the classic paradigm here with the Wisconsin card sort. And this was really just to make sure that it could do the kind of thing that we saw previous models do. And sure enough, it's able to solve that Wisconsin card sort task and be able to decide between the different rules that we've set. So these are just decision accuracies that we have. I will say there was one model that did fail to learn. We had 100 models that we trained, and that one just ended up being a chance. And so there are sometimes learning instabilities that could happen. They're rare, but they do occasionally happen. So that's why N is 99 here. But over time, switching between these different rules, it was able to do so. And this is also an example of using a reinforcement learning signal. So the two tasks before, the logic gates and the MNIST tasks here, using the digits, are both supervised learning tasks. But this is really a reinforcement learning task. So you're just given feedback on whether you're right or wrong, not what the correct answer is. That's important because we want to show that it can apply, again, to a wider range of deep learning contexts, not just to one particular situation. Our final test that we gave was working this on a temporally extended reinforcement learning task where you're trying to solve a 1D maze. It's a very typical kind of reinforcement learning problem. So you want to have an agent that's trying to find its fastest way to get to a goal, but those goals will sometimes occasionally move around. So you're really solving a different task when the goal moves. And you need to be able to learn policies that can get you to the goal as fast as possible. And you want to be able to remember the old ones in case you switch back into running through the old maze. So in this case, we also have a situation where we have a temporally extended reinforcement learning task. That means it takes many time steps to learn the right sequence of actions. And our models are able to do that. Now, I know that's fast, but I'm trying to give you guys both the context and also to show that we applied the context layer across a wide range of different kinds of tasks in deep learning. So the only thing I'll leave you with to walk away from is this current architecture, right? It solves this type of feedback-based switching, which so far hasn't existed in any of the existing frameworks. So it's not in PyTorch or wasn't in Tensorflow prior to this. And it's inspired by these neurobiological mechanisms of how we think task switching happens in the brain. So I know it's fast in the end, but I hope that things were clear there, but I'll stick around in case you guys have additional questions. So one last thing I'll wrap up with. So this is obviously done by lots of students in the lab. It's primarily done here by David Ludwig and Lucas Remedios. Lucas started on the project working on building the initial work into Keras and Tensorflow based off of Mike Jovanovich's work. He was the one who kind of came up with the initial feedback-based switching mechanism, abstracting from those working memory models, those details. But Lucas took it over, moved into Keras and Tensorflow a little bit. David finished it up, and then we came up with the battery of tests that we would run to be able to validate that it worked on all these different kinds of tasks. And so that's just kind of the overview of the rest of the lab. But I'll leave it there, and if you have any questions, let me know.
So thank you, Josh. I'm going to do the clappy hands thing. So there you go. So I'm going to ask a first question, which is I'm trying to figure out where this is going to be kind of critical in the landscape of machine learning so it's a cognitive thing, but it's also going to have practical applications. Can you talk a little bit about like where you might see this being used in kind of the machine learning context?
Yeah, I mean, so it's robust intelligence, so you do have to think a little outside the box there, right? We're not fitting in typical machine learning paradigm.
Right.
I think my coffee maker example, I think is a good one. So, when I come in and push the button on my Keurig every day, I get coffee out. Right? But if I suddenly come in one day and I push the button on the coffee maker and I don't get coffee, the way typical machine learning algorithms respond is they unlearn that pushing buttons makes coffee, right? It actually breaks the algorithm. Right. So just the ability to switch to another context and start learning under that will keep you from forgetting your old information, so that when situations get back into place, you can just start back where you started. You will not forget your old information. So that alone is like dealing with errors or situations where things have broken down, allow the system to robustly respond. Even if that context is a broken context that you're never going to really use, it allows you not to forget your old information in light of that. So I think that's just the most practical example off the block that we want with this. Anytime you have a system that needs to deal with a changing environment where things might happen that it can't predict, it won't be broken as a result of getting that kind of bad feedback from the environment.
Right. I mean, I can see the error correct, the adapting to errors and recognizing errors being really critical. Because I mean, that happens all the time. As you said, you press the button and the coffee maker doesn't do that. You don't want to have it unlearn that there's no coffee in the world, or do something crazy about its learning. On the other hand,
yes,
really
things
cool.
that a model has been learning to do really well, it should just keep doing well, and it should trust itself to some degree that it has done a good job, and not unlearn that information. So that is, I think, the most practical application that we'll see going forward. On the other side, just task switching itself is a useful strategy. We might just say we have an AI, and yes, we've trained it to run this task, but I don't have another AI sitting around. Let's get it to do this other thing as well. And the truth is, it could learn to do the other task. You don't need to have a new model, and it could switch back to the others. So there's some sort of, farther reaching. It's like having sort of groups of agents. They could all be responsible for different things, but if one goes down or has trouble, you could swap it out for some of the others that are already existing, and they could take over the job, you might say. But I do think that's a little bit more far-reaching. The immediate pressing need would just be to robustly respond to error conditions.
Yeah, like when you start, I mean, I can think of all sorts of things you'd want it to robustly correct for. Like if you lose an aileron in an airplane, you don't want it to try and be like, oh, ailerons don't work at all. No,
and you can actually
still have one.
And we could pre-train even that somewhat in simulation, maybe to respond to those conditions and get it ready, and it would actually be ready to respond, right? It would be sort of ready to switch, and you'd have optimal decisions under both conditions. They won't be learning on top of each other.
Right. Really interesting. Other questions from the audience?
I had a quick question. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yep.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Excellent. When it detects that it needs to switch context to a different task, is it intelligently trying to pick the new context, or is it just random until it works?
Yeah, so there's actually two strategies involved. Normally, it's not intelligent, and that's just meaning that it depends a little on the signals that you're getting. So like let's say you have 5 options on the table, you have 5 things that you might try, like 5 of these ATRs, and you get a signal that's if it's reinforcement learning especially, the signal is really just right or wrong, right? So in a reinforcement learning context, then if you're working with 1, you're saying, okay, I'm working with task 1, and you get an answer that says wrong. Well, you need to switch, but do you switch to 2, 3, 4, 5? You really don't know. There's not enough information in the feedback to tell you which one to switch to. So normally we just rotate to the next one and proceed. But there are situations where in supervised learning context, like when we're learning the number task or the logic gates, the specific feedback that you're getting may give you some indication about which one you should switch to. And in those contexts, yes, you can basically say, okay, out of my other hypotheses, we immediately analyze which one is the best fitting or would produce the least error, and we switch to that one first. So it actually depends on the kind of feedback that you get, whether you would employ that strategy or not. But you need both mechanisms. Sometimes you just need to rotate to the next one because the feedback wasn't clear enough. But then there is this, if you do have the current enough feedback signal, you'll switch to the ones that are appropriate. Even then, there might be some contention around a subset, and you would just have to just roll to the next one in the subset. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was great.
So other questions, you can respond either on chat or obviously through audio by meeting.
Yes, I have a kind of a question. I remember you talking about for the holographic thing, you're saying you would create random vectors for different concepts like red and ball, and you'd convolve them together to create a third concept like red ball.
Yes.
Can we go back to that page?
Sure.
I found that really interesting. Can you do that with 3 or more items?
You can.
Awesome.
Yeah, because of the compressive nature, you can keep convolving as many times as you want. Now, there's a limitation, of course, it's lossy. So, you can eventually end up with situations where things start to look similar at some point to something else that already exists. That's really dependent on the length of the vectors that you choose, which is n, right? That n decides on the space that you have to work with. But it does still give you the ability to compress those representations in the same length vectors. From our perspective, what's useful is that that thing is orthogonal to the previous examples. So when we're convolving with abstract task 1, that means you're sort of saying treat all the things we're looking at right here differently from what you would if you're convolving it with another representation. You know, the neural net sees them as orthogonal concepts, right? We're learning them in different ways. And I think that actually reason why the network's able to do it. Now that also affects the learning updates and the weights. They're also not in conflict with one another. So it actually has a direct impact on the learning algorithms.
Interesting.
So I'm curious how it's orthogonal, because it seems like it's a linear combination of previous things. So how, I mean, I'm just looking at the little white box. So I still don't quite understand the orthogonality of it and why that actually occurs.
Well, so I'll say Plate's got all the proofs on when it happens. And I said it is lossy.
Okay.
It's approximate. It's not exact, right? And if
Okay.
you don't pick n big enough, it won't be, right? You
Okay.
have to be the right size. Yeah. You know,
So big N matters. Yeah, that makes
it's got
sense.
to be relatively big n. Yeah. I mean, but so you are dependent on having a certain number of resources, or you couldn't do it, right?
Okay. Nice. Other questions? So what's your next steps on this? I mean, what are the next things you're gonna be working on?
Yeah, good. So the question, so what we have, let's see if I can show you guys. So some of the working memory work has, we had another model that's not deep learning based that also used working memory to solve the sort of sensory based tasks as well. So not just feedback based switching. So what I mean by that is we have these little tasks, and I'll switch back to this other one. This will tell you about it. So, you know, we have these little maze tasks where you have an agent that's trying to learn what way to go, and eventually it's trying to find a goal. But you can develop these things which I call partially observable mazes, where you shine a little light or signal right before at the start of the task, and then you turn it off for the rest of the task. So the idea is that that signal is correlated with where the goal is. I mean, you're basically being told the goal is somewhere, right? You know, but as soon as the light turns off, if the system has no memory of some kind, then it can't keep track of that signal, and it'll be lost. It won't know whether to go towards the goal for the green task or the goal for the red task, for example, if there are those two lights. So you need some sort of memory to maintain that. And this is one of the tasks we've done with our working memory models and successfully solved them. But we call that sensory-based working memory, because you actually do get information before you need it to make the decision. Feedback, it's only happening right when the feedback's delivered, which is what I talked about today. But that we combine those two together, you know, to be able to create a model that could solve both simultaneously. But we did it without Keras and Tensorflow. We did at least show that yes, you could solve these kinds of tasks with both kinds of mechanisms in your working memory. They seem to work. But there are already existing deep learning models that solve the partially observable task. They're not using working memory. They've already pretty much, I would say, solved it. So this is an example here, this Perisotto paper, stabilizing transformers for reinforcement learning. Like, this is probably the way you would go to solve partial observability. What I just talked about, the red-green maze, you would use that. But it doesn't have the feedback mechanisms. So our goal next would maybe combine them with these and see if we can do both sensory-based and feedback-based in the deep learning framework. Right? That's where we want to go next.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. I mean, the other option would be doing something really applied, like, you know, looking at quad copper, or I don't know, hex copter performance, actually what happens when you lose an engine. I mean, and have it see about context switching this versus deep learning versus just traditional algorithms. I mean, there'd be, you know, I mean, showing the impact of what it would have might be interesting too, but that's a whole other different direction. I mean, that's a,
yeah. I mean, you know, these are the machine learning steps, right?
yeah.
We have one other cool idea, which is that right now we're thinking we can find a way, if we stack the layers, that we might be able to have very, very large numbers of contexts encoded with very few vectors. So that's
Nice.
another way that we're going. So, you know, sort of like growing, you know, it's kind of like the idea that you can have, two bits and you're combining 4 things, 3 bits to do 8 things, and so on. You can say that's 2 vectors for 4 items, 3 vectors for 8 items. So if we stack, vectors, each context layer just has 2 things, but you stack enough of them, you could in theory represent arbitrarily, an exponentially growing number of possible task contexts in the same model. But it's tricky. Having those layers play well with each other is an open area that we have to investigate more. So those are our 2 directions, though, that we're thinking we can take it.
It's cool you've moved this into a deep learning framework. Like, I mean, that's really, really nifty. That's going to be,
Yeah. Our prior stuff was all custom R and Python code, right?
right.
So, yeah, not as easy for other people to pick up, but this is something you get the paper, the GitHub links in the paper, you could download the code, and it uses traditional training loops. It's all in Keras. You can just plug it in just like you would, any other Keras model now.
Nice. Anything else from the audience? Well, Josh, thank you again for speaking today. If you have any other questions, you can just hang around afterwards. I'm going to end the recording at this point, and we'll see you all next week, hopefully.